Multiple states are working to change voting laws this year ahead of the midterm elections. In 2021, 19 states passed laws that added restrictions to how people vote. The Brennan Center for Justice, a progressive organization, has identified 88 restrictive bills that have carried over into this year's legislative session. A new article on CBSNews.com looks into where these laws are being considered and what could happen in the year ahead. And Adam Brewster wrote that piece, and he's here to talk a little bit more about it. So, Adam, the thing about the 2020 election is that there were a lot of exceptions made because of the pandemic that made it a lot easier for people to vote. And the hope was that some of those would stick. Many of them are not. In fact, there are even more restrictive things policies coming into place. What are you expecting to see this year in terms of laws affecting how we vote?
Certainly, we saw a lot of action last year, especially regarding ways to vote absentee and ways to vote by mail. And that's what a lot of states are looking at doing again this year. You're seeing things about potentially shortening the time that it takes to request an absentee ballot, or adding ID requirements, or changing some of the regulations regarding drop boxes. These are many of the things we saw states around the country enact last year, in addition to certainly other sorts of measures. And you look at Georgia. One of the Republican leaders in the Senate has introduced a bill that would ban absentee ballot drop boxes in the state. Last year, there was a law change to sort of reduce the number of absentee ballot drop boxes that counties could set up. Florida, Ron DeSantis has talked about adding an election integrity unit and sort of putting more rules around security at drop boxes. Missouri and Arizona are among states that are looking to add new ID requirements in terms of voting. So it's a lot of the same measures that we saw states put in place last year. We talked a lot about Georgia and Texas and Florida and Iowa, but there were many other states that sometimes didn't necessarily pass those huge bills that took large sections of election law and made big changes, but sometimes went through one by one, made changes on a more individual basis. And we can expect 2022 to be another year where we see a lot of election bills at least being considered and debated in state legislatures.
So, Adam, as you know, the Senate's looking to pass the legislation that would expand that voting access by Martin Luther King Jr. Day. That's just next week. It doesn't look like lawmakers will meet that self-imposed deadline. But if Congress does pass these bills, what kind of effect would that have on these more restrictive laws passed at the state level in those 19 states?
It will be hard for Congress to meet that deadline. It may be hard for Congress to even pass anything altogether. But if they were to come to an agreement, and Democrats were to find a way that they could get 50 of their members to agree to change the rules, what those laws do is one, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act restores a section of the Voting Rights Act that sort of requires pre-clearance before certain states or counties or even cities change their voting laws. And then there's the Freedom to Vote Act, which sort of sets national standards for federal elections, the amount of time that you have to offer for early in-person voting, no excuse of absentee voting, sets a national standard for voter ID and the types of identification that can be accepted, and then exceptions for people who don't have voter ID. There's some campaign finance changes in there. So it's sort of a big sweeping regulation. Republicans have said this is, the federal government coming in and telling states how to run their elections. And Democrats said, look, this is about setting a floor so that at least all 50 states, everyone, there is a bare minimum standard to vote. And then, states can sort of go beyond that. But this sort of sets the floor for what states would need to allow.
So you interviewed an election law expert for your piece. What did he say about the stalemate when it comes to voting rights bills in Congress?
It's Edward Foley, who's a professor of election law at Ohio State University. And, he took some swipes at Democrats for basically saying the party has gone out, and any attempt by Republicans to change their voting laws after 2020 was an amounting to voter suppression, and saying, there were efforts to force Republicans to sort of sign on to Democratic bills at the federal level rather than finding, potential common ground or perhaps lowering some of the requests that Democrats had. Of course, that's much easier said than done, right? It might be hard to get 50 or 60 United States senators to agree that it was cold in New York City yesterday. And we all live here and we know that it was cold in New York City yesterday. But if you look at a state like Kentucky, they have a Republican-dominated legislature, a Democratic governor, and last year they changed their election laws. I don't think either party would walk away and say we got everything that we wanted, but they found a way to come together and change their election laws in a bipartisan way when Republicans didn't necessarily need to get the Democratic governor involved in that. So there are ways to do that on a sort of bipartisan basis. You're seeing that around the Electoral Count Act right now. That's also something that Edward Foley and other election law experts have been saying needs to be changed, and that deals with the way that votes are counted on January 6th after states have certified their election and sent their slate of electors to Congress.
We know Republican lawmakers in Arizona called for a review of the 2020 election results in Maricopa County. President Biden won that county and the state. It was the first time it had gone blue since Bill Clinton back in '96. And the results of that review actually added votes to President Biden's total. You found out other states are looking to hold their own reviews. What are they trying to accomplish more than a year after the election, Adam?
There are some states that have, bills that could be taken up this year, Florida, New Hampshire, South Carolina, to sort of look back at 2020. This is already happening in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, where Republicans have pushed efforts to look back at the 2020 election. And those who've been pushing for these say, this isn't about going back and overturning the election, but it's about making sure that the laws were followed or if there's procedures that need to be done. And there are many election experts who have raised concerns about these sorts of reviews, especially when they're driven by one particular party, to say, they've sometimes led to faulty conclusions. And if you have faulty conclusions and you're using that as a reason to potentially change your laws, you may be changing your laws for a reason that isn't necessary. So there'll be something close to watch. It can take a lot of agreement when it's done through, passing a law and getting a governor to sign on to it rather than sort of being ordered by a particular branch of the state legislature, which is what we saw in Arizona. It's what we see in Wisconsin and what happened in Pennsylvania.
The thing about it is that people hear the big lie over and over again, and they believe it, even though we know that the 2020 elections were incredibly safe, even though we know that Republicans have said that they were fair and safe. Governor Ron DeSantis even called Florida's election in 2020, quote, the smoothest, most successful election of any state in the country. But now he's calling for lawmakers to create a law enforcement division to investigate allegations of voter fraud and other voting issues. And I want to show you the results of this CBS News poll that shows that 2/3 of Republicans believe voter fraud was widespread during the presidential election, despite the fact that there is no evidence of any fraud. How is this going to affect the midterms this year, do you think?
This is going to be something that looms over midterm elections, whether it is races for U.S. Senate, whether it's races for governor, races for Secretary of State, Congress, state legislature, and particularly in Republican primaries. We're seeing this play out because a big chunk of the Republican base, as you just pointed out, believes there was, widespread fraud enough to potentially overturn the election when we know there is no evidence of widespread fraud, and certainly on a scale that would have changed the results of the 2020 election. But you're going to see former President Trump. He has been going out there at rallies that he held last year since he left office. He'll return to the rally circuit this week in Arizona, talking about these sorts of issues. If you look at who's set to join him in Arizona, it's some congressmen who have promoted the ideas of widespread fraud. It's a candidate for governor who he's endorsed in Arizona who has made claims of widespread fraud a big part of her campaign. You see many Republicans in primaries sort of echoing those claims, perhaps in hopes of securing the former president's endorsement in a race. So it's going to be something that is a huge factor. And then you're going to look at some state races, whether that's for governor or Secretary of State, where you're going to see governors, in states like Michigan and Wisconsin saying, hey, we know Republicans are probably going to have control of the legislature here. This is something where, the veto pen is the one thing that you can impact. Pennsylvania is another state where you'll probably see that play out. So it's something that's going to happen not just in Senate races and in federal races, but at those state level races, governors and state legislative races, and certainly Secretary of State races. There's candidates running to run the elections who have promoted these sort of claims of widespread fraud, looking to run their elections one day. That's going to be a big factor in those races as well. So it is something that is been talked about now for, we're in 2022. It's not 2020 or 2021 anymore. And it's going to continue to be talked about, especially as we get closer to primary season later in the spring and the summer.
All right. Adam Brewster, thank you very much, my friend. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Vlad.
You can read Adam's full piece and the rest of his reporting by visiting cbsnews.com.